You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics to culture and the arts.
Hello and welcome to a conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Nasim Ahmed and I will be your host for today's discussion. We are discussing the global rise of nationalism and authoritarianism with my guest today, Professor Saul Takahashi.
Hi.
Saul is a professor of human rights and peace studies at Osaka Jogakuin University in Japan. He is a former UN civil servant. He lived in Palestine for 5 years as a deputy head of office of the UN Human Rights Agency. Saul is also the author of several books, including Civil and Political Rights in Japan. Welcome to the show, Professor Saul.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. It's great.
It's great to have you on the show. For someone, Saul, who has worked in Palestine on human rights issues for the length of time that you've had, I feel I must, ask you about the recent Amnesty International report this week, which declared Israel to be an apartheid state. Do you think, that all the major human rights group, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, now Amnesty, and many others, of course, as well, would reach such a consensus so rapidly, in sequence of few years? I want to ask that before we get into the main conversation we have in mind.
Sure. About the sort of process of those organizations forming their consensus. Of course, they're always in discussion with each other and that kind of thing. But I think it's more the real question is, why did it take so long? The facts are staring everybody in the face. They have been for decades. Palestinians have been, calling the attention of the international community to the clear and indisputable fact that Israel is an apartheid state. Since 1948, they've been doing this. But basically, nobody really took heed outside of the Palestinian community. So it's about time. I don't know what took everybody so long. That's what I feel. I think I'm going to go out on a little bit of a limb here, and I think one of the things that's behind this sort of movement to recognize Israel for what it is, I think. And I don't think it's at the forefront of people's consciousness in those human rights organizations, but I think there's a general movement towards a better recognition of human rights as something which can bring about really systemic and even revolutionary change. And I think that's really important. Human rights law, and certainly law in general, is generally not sort of suited towards toppling everything. That's just not the tool that can be used in that kind of way. It only brings about, most of the time, it brings about change, but it can bring about change, but it brings about incremental change, working within the system. But I think, this amongst a couple of other developments, such as the movement towards recognizing, or at least as well, we're not there yet, but talk of a right to a healthy environment and those kind of discussions, not to mention, of course, the right to self-determination and all the kind of quote unquote group rights that have finally sort of received a kind of recognition. There's more of an understanding that human rights can be used in much broader and more fundamental ways than has been the case up till now. And I think that's a really great development. As for just talking about Palestine, of course, it's significant. I think what's really significant, and where things aren't quite as far, these organizations haven't gone quite as far as I would like, but still what is significant is the recognition of what's going on within the 48 borders, of course. So we're not just talking about the West Bank and Gaza. We're also talking about 48, what is commonly known as the State of Israel. So that's very significant. And I really do think the writing is on the wall for these Israeli practices, no question.
Yeah, we will return to human rights right at the end of our conversation. I have a number of other questions on this issue, but I'd like to begin with the conversation which we have in mind, and visit the article you recently wrote in Politics Today, who I should thank for also helping us to organize this interview. It wasn't about the Middle East, but it was about Japan. And in it, you discuss themes around the rise of authoritarian nationalism, which has taken roots across many countries and is continuing to break through in many others. So can you speak about these developments and the changes that are taking place politically and socially within Japanese society that, you fear at least, may give rise to the ugly kind of nationalism which we saw in the past?
Sure. Well, I mean, this has actually been going on for a very long time. I mean, it's not so new. As a matter of fact, in many ways, it's been going on since really immediately after the war. So 1945, the late 40s, even when Japan was under American occupation, there was this kind of movement, certainly amongst the political elites and the people who had the power in society, to try to roll back any kind of fundamental reforms that the Americans wanted, and really to sort of make sure that there was no accountability for the wartime atrocities that Japan had committed. And that's, in my mind, that's really key here. I mean, there really has never been any kind of accountability. There was a sort of there was a trial, a series of trials in the same way or a similar way to there were trials in Nuremberg, but they never really were that effective. I mean, at a much earlier stage, certainly the Americans sort of stepped in and tried to sort of tone things down because it saw Japan as a bulwark against communism in Asia. So really, some people were thrown in jail for a little bit of time, and then they were quietly released, and then they returned to their positions of power. So, there's never been any kind of serious accountability, and there's never been any kind of serious effort to really sort of stare directly at the terrible things that Japan had done during the war. And that's been something that's been going on since then. I would say really, it's only appeared in the kind of overt form that we see now very recently. So it seems like a new development, but it's been going on for a while. And really, the right has spent 20 years more sort of spreading their narratives at the grassroots level to an extent which it can be quite frightening. I mean, I meet all sorts of different people. And I was working in business and human rights for a while. Just sort of giving out an example, but I was working in business and human rights after I had left the UN and came back to Japan. This was 2014, and I was with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, which is also based in London, by the way. And that's an international human rights NGO that works on business and human rights issues. And anyway, I was meeting with people in really household name Japanese companies, and meeting with, sort of working together with some of the people who really did believe that Japanese businesses had to shape up their act. They had to change the way they were doing things, and they had to, really sort of take seriously human rights if they were to survive in today's world. And they believed in it. I mean, that they were, I like to think that they really honestly believed in the importance of human rights as well. And so in that way, we would sort of have a shared set of values. So I liked to think. But when it came to discussion of certain topics, in particular the comfort women issue, I mean, it was just shocking. It was like sort of like people used to call Palestine, the issue of Palestine in the United States, the petting zoo, where children go to zoos and they start petting, they can pet the goats and everything. And all of a sudden one of the goats goes crazy and sort of, bites off the fingers of these children. It was sort of like that. I mean, when I touched upon issues of wartime atrocities, in particular the comfort women, but other issues which had also been sort of coming to the forefront at the time, they would just go crazy, or they just refused to believe that it ever happened. And that was it. It was all propaganda that was propagated by Korea and by the Chinese and by sort of anti-Japanese elements within Japan. And that's it's the mainstreaming of that terminology and that whole sort of notion of Japanese who are anti-Japanese. There's a word for this. It's Hannichi, if you're interested. But there's a word for this. And this was, when I had left Japan in '94 and I moved abroad, and I completed my studies, and then I started working in human rights. That word didn't really exist. But in the 20 years that I had been abroad, and of course I'd been coming back, at least once a year, and I had seen how this had started to emerge, but it just became completely mainstream. And so this notion that there's a fifth column within our country, that these left-wing organizations, human rights organizations, lawyers, these evil people are cooperating with our enemies outside and painting a picture of the most moral country in the world, Japan, as having committed these terrible atrocities. This really has become, in many ways, it's become almost mainstream. And people, they would look at.
Which is what I want to ask you. Get into the next question. I mean, because you mentioned that it's been going on really since the Second World War. One question would be, why is it that Germany liberalized in the way it did and Japan hadn't or hasn't? And secondly, why has it raised your concern right now? Because you've written 2 articles recently.
Sure.
So what's happening now for you to feel that this has become mainstream? Sure. And so go ahead. Why now?
Okay, no, fair enough. Yeah, sure. Why now? Of course. No, fair enough. I mean, about Germany, that's always the comparison that people make. That the people, the few people on the left in Japan now that is always the comparison that we make. That look at Germany and they educate their children about their atrocities during the war and why is it that Japan can't do that? Why is it that every time a new round of textbooks are approved by the government, why is it that there's always this huge hoo-ha about whether the comfort women are going to appear in textbooks and all this kind of thing? I personally don't have a real answer for that, but I think it's just that there was accountability, certainly to a certain extent, in Germany through the Nuremberg trials, and there wasn't that level of accountability in Japan. It just never happened. So the people who the political elite, the people in power, they had been in power during the war, and they, with a blank of maybe a couple of years here or there, they basically remained in power. And that's really, and it's to this day, it remains the case. So why is it that it's coming up now? It's just that it's certainly since the early 2000s, and really very much in an extreme, overt way since 2012, it's just become much more in your face. Part of that has been a cumulative thing, but part of it is also that changes within what has always been the ruling party in Japan, the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP. The LDP has basically ruled Japan nonstop, practically nonstop since 1955, since it was formed in 1955, when a couple of conservative political parties merged. And they have had, they're in a coalition now, and they've had to sort of strike deals with a couple of other conservative political parties as well. But they've basically been in power with a couple of years blank here and there since then. So really, in many ways, the LDP was like the Communist Party in the Soviet Union or in China. It was really the only game in town. So if you wanted power, then you had to join the LDP. That was the only way to do it. Now, through the early 90s, you had this sort of LDP as the be-all and end-all of all politics. And the only politics that really meant anything were internal politics, factions arguing with other factions. Now, what I'm trying to get at is that there were forces within the LDP that constrained this kind of extremist element within the LDP. But in the mid-90s, the LDP sort of fell apart, and it shedded a lot of members, and there's this huge political chaos where all these small political parties were formed, and it sort of that continued on for a few years. But the result of that really was that what we have in the LDP is a bunch of extremists. That's really what we've been left with, and the few elements that had sort of acted as a constraint on those people, they've gone to other parties and they just sort of fell out of political significance. They've retired, and that's sort of been the end of them. So that's really what we're left at. But in 2012, the premiership of Abe became prime minister. He was prime minister also a little bit earlier in the 2000s, but he had to resign seemingly for health-related reasons in a very quick period of time. But he's always been one of the heroes of these extremist elements of the right. And he became prime minister in 2012, and he ended up serving until 2020. He actually became the longest serving prime minister in modern Japan. And he was a avowed nationalist, very openly, overtly bullish nationalist. And he really changed the narrative changed the public discourse in a very sort of negative way. To be nationalist was a good thing. To be against any kind of these, overtly nationalist and very overtly violative of human rights measures that he kept on introducing, you were anti-Japanese. You were one of the enemies. So this really, I think, changed the discourse. Now, he had to resign in 2020, and we're on the second prime minister since then. They have been less overt, and I think partially because of having to deal with the COVID crisis and all this kind of thing has sort of taken up their attention. But the LDP is full of extremes. I mean, basically that's what we're left with. So it's really it's come out in a much more overt form over recent years.
So are there telltale signs you're looking for? I mean, because you mentioned, I think, in your piece that once the authoritarian nationalism genie is out of the bottle, it's difficult to put back in. We see this, of course, in many other countries. Hungary, for example.
Yeah, sure.
Viktor Orban has captured the state and has now created an us and them narrative, stoking fears of Muslims. But do you see something similar in Japan where once the genie is out and something happens and there is no turning back for Japan would have been captured by a far-right extremist nationalist group?
I mean, I don't know if we're at the point yet where, I can say we're at the point of no return. I'm not sure we're there just yet, but certainly the signs are there. I mean, one of the very stark signs that I've been talking about is this whole discourse of being anti-Japanese, the Hannichi. And this is really, you see it everywhere. The whole sort of anti-Chinese narratives that you see constantly, this is permeated through to really the mainstream. Any kind of media that you turn on or you look at the newspapers, and it's almost like this endless stream of China is a threat. We've got to be careful of China. China is after us. China is a security threat. All these kind of things. China as the boogeyman for all social ills. We see this very, very starkly. And but there is one more thing that I just want to add, and that is the role of the media. And it is very, what is very interesting. I always hesitate to use the word interesting in these kind of contexts, but what is very notable is, during the war, in the run-up to the war, of course, the media was essentially controlled by the military and by the right wing. So they basically acted as a mouthpiece for the military. Now, like the other sectors of people in power, they've never really sort of held a reckoning of that period. People in the media like to pretend that they were under very strict censorship, but that's not the case. Direct censorship only started really in the middle of the war. Up till then, there wasn't any. And yet, scholars have shown these kind of things, and you could see these, these articles, these editorials, and everything. The media people were scrambling all over each other, falling all over each other, trying to show which one was the more nationalist, trying to outdo all the others in being, bullish, right-wing, nationalistic. And that's something that really has to be said. They were not forced to be the mouthpiece of the military. They went out of their way to do it. And it's not quite as overt now. It's not quite as direct, of course, but the media in Japan is still very, how should I put this? They operate in a really restrictive environment, and they operate in an environment that I wouldn't say forces, but certainly encourages them to self-censor and censor one another. In Japan, we have this quite unique system called ksha clubs, or press clubs, if you like, but they bear no resemblance to how press clubs look like in most other countries. I mean, they are self-regulating bodies that sort of, basically there was a bunch of rooms in each ministry. When the ministry wants to hold a press conference, it holds it at the ksha club. When a ministry guy or a politician wants to go and give an off-the-record briefing, he goes to the ksha club and he says, "Okay, guys, come around the table. These are the rules for this off-the-record briefing," and that's it. So it acts as basically a cartel, an information cartel, and journalists that break the rules, which happen very, very rarely, but journalists who break the rules are censored not even by the government. It's by their fellow journalists. It's the other journalists who say, "Oh, we've got to make sure that he follows the rules. Otherwise, we're all going to be shut out." For a mainstream media outlet, being kicked out of the ksha club is, this is a death sentence. So they can't have that. So basically, it forces them, it creates a situation where they self-censor, they censor each other. And we see this, we see this every day, but we see this now. One example is a journalist, her name is Mochizuki-san. And she made a name of herself sort of looking into Japanese weapons exports. And, so she has a very sort of critical eye over a lot of sort of government policies. Now, she was given the prime minister's office beat, and she was acting. So she was like in these press conferences, she was asking very, very uncomfortable questions, not being satisfied with the usual sort of fobbing off by the politicians, but saying, no, that's not good enough. I want an answer, and I want an answer now. This is what my journalists are supposed to do. But she was just heavily criticized, not only by the politicians, by the government, but also by the other journalists. You had the other journalists ganging up on her. She would, I remember this was February last year, I think it was, she sent out a tweet saying, "Oh, it's got to the point where they're not even calling on me to ask questions at the press conference," which is probably, it certainly wouldn't surprise me at all. And then you had editorials in the mainstream newspapers saying, "Oh, it's very unfortunate that this, Mochizuki-san is spreading misinformation about what's going on. And, the rules of the ksha club are very clear." You have the journalists ganging up on her and being the sort of guardian of the establishment. And, this is a very, very worrying sign. Again, it's not a new thing, but we see it in a much more insidious way now.
It's pretty standard practice, I guess, in the playbook of authoritarianism, instill fear in this kind of fashion. But if I can just zoom out of Japan for a bit and share with you an alarming statistic published last year by the Freedom House Project in its 2021 report, which said that only a fifth, there's been a sharp decline in the number of countries practicing democracy. And a sharp rise in autocratic government around the world. Only 1/5 of the world's population now live under a democracy. Of course, each country has its own unique reasons why this is happening, and you've given us a really good account of why it's happening in Japan. But what do you think are the global factors driving this? Because as I mentioned, it's a phenomenon that's happening all across the world. What are the key global factors? And if we can focus on this for a bit, and that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm not really going to say anything, shockingly unique here. I think the rise of neoliberalism as an economic philosophy, or even an economic, that's what I'm looking for, economic religion, even if you like, is really one of the key factors behind all of this. People had stable jobs, people had, union jobs. People had, some sort of continuity and some sort of ability to sort of see their lives getting better and the lives of their children getting better in a material sense. And that kind of stability has, in many, many countries and many, many different areas, has just been decimated. And we see people, just sort of, just in the UK, for example, these 0-hour contracts, welfare being cut to the bone, these kind of things that are going on. In Japan, the stable employment has basically gone out of the window for a large portion of the populace. I think the last statistics I saw was 30% of the population is on these kind of gig jobs, mixed jobs that don't have any kind of stability. Basically, they are on contracts, and that never used to be the case. In Japan, you got a job out of university, out of secondary school, out of even middle school. You got a job for life. And loyalty was expected on your part, but loyalty was also given on the part of, from the company. There were, it was, I'm not saying it was heaven. There were issues with that, because once you got off of the tracks at any certain point, then that was pretty much the end of you in terms of mainstream society. But as long as, there was a social contract, and that social contract is pretty much gone. And it's gone in Japan, and it's gone in, I think, in many, many countries as well. And that, sort of lack of that, destroying of stability, that lack of stability, continuity, ability to predict what's going on, and lack of faith that, people's lives are getting better. That is certainly one of the key factors behind, all of this kind of thing, I think. Yeah. So that's really, I think.
Yeah. So neoliberalism, globalization. I wonder if you think 9/11 is an issue as well, because if you listen, for example, to the Russian, Chinese, and why they are placing Muslims in concentration camp, they'll say, we're fighting terrorism. Every authoritarian regime in the Middle East to say, we're fighting terrorism when they abuse, human rights. In Europe is the same. Muslims are the boogeyman, rise of terrorism. So I think if a decade of war on terror, do you think it's done something to the mindset of a lot of these regimes, even democratic ones, where if the rule maker can break the rules, and chipping away at the system, chipping away and undermining the global system. Of course, Israel is a classic example of occupation,
sure.
never-ending occupation, So if the rules are chipped away in this kind of fashion, civil liberties are stripped away, even in the US, why not? Why wouldn't that empower and encourage Russia, China, India, Middle Eastern autocrats to say, to hell with the laws and the rules. If the US can do it, we'll do it as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, the global war on terror has, of course, been a complete catastrophe in every single way, shape, and form. And I definitely agree with you. I mean, that has also been one of the driving forces. Securitization is also definitely one of the driving forces, but behind this. One thing that I do a lot of research on Islamophobia, and I publish things on Islamophobia in Japan, and I'm also doing research on Europe as well. And one of the things that's very striking is how Muslims being branded as a security threat. And that, of course, 9/11 was really the big watershed with that. Of course, I mean, it had been going on for a long time before as well, but that was really what gave the impetus behind, or at least the justification for governments to go all out. And we see, Muslims have been branded as a security threat, but more and more governments are shifting, not just governments, but, the sort of popular discourse as well. But really governments are shifting towards branding Muslims as a threat to Western culture and Western society. And not just as a sort of security threat, not just as a "you're all terrorists" kind of mantra, but all, just your religion, your customs, just your mere existence is somehow a threat to our culture. And we see, we're seeing that more and more. I think one of the countries that I'm doing research on is Denmark, for example. And this has been a little bit, there's been focused on a little bit in the international media. Their ghetto policies of particular neighborhoods being designated openly as ghetto. They changed the terminology recently, but the policies are the same. And you're designated as a ghetto if you have over a certain percent of unemployment and a certain percent of people who haven't, graduated from secondary education. There are all these sort of social factors, but also there has to be a certain percentage of residents who come from a quote unquote non-Western background. This being, of course, code for Muslims, and everybody knows it is. I mean, it's very open. Right. So the residents of the ghettos have these kind of special measures imposed on them. One of the ones that's, one of the ones really striking is that children from the age of 1, they have to go to daycare. They're forced to go to daycare at least a number of, I think it's 30, 35 hours a week. Maybe it's a little bit less, something like that. And they, in the daycare center, they are to learn Danish values. Whereas, people who do not reside in the ghettos, they don't have this kind of special obligation. It's up to them whether they want to put their children in daycare or not. And, the whole sort of discourse is very much, they are a problem. They are a parallel society. And they are, they're a threat to Western values and Western culture. So we have to make sure that the children grow up with Western Danish values. That's really the whole narrative. And, we see this more and more. Certainly, I've been seeing this more and more. It's not a linear thing, and it doesn't mean that the security, the whole security stuff is abandoned. Of course, that's still there, but it's very much, it's getting more and more prevalent, I think, and that's really a worrying sign.
Yeah, we of course we see this trend in Europe a lot. I mentioned Hungary,
Sure.
France, of course, Austria as well. China, India, but we don't hear much about this from Japan. I mean, we mentioned, that one of the in the playbook of authoritarianism is
Sure.
us and them. And
Yes.
if you want to have a hierarchy of the them in Europe, generally it's the Muslim communities. In India, it's
sure.
definitely the
Sure.
Muslims. China, Muslims are the ones who are them, and our project to modernize and nationalize is really against the barbarian Muslim. And that template is replicated across Europe. But it's also happening in Japan. I mean, what's the Muslim population there in Japan? And do you see that happening in Japan as well?
Sure. Well, I mean, the minority that generally gets the brunt of these kind of, generally targeted for these kind of measures is the Korean community, of course. Yes, the Korean community in Japan. The Muslim community is quite small. That having been said, we're talking, the last estimate was, I think, 200,000, 20 man. Yeah, that's right. So 200,000 or so, which in a country of 120 million is not a lot of people, but it's, it's growing, and it's definitely it's more and more significant. What I think personally is very significant is that there are, of that 200,000, it's estimated that about one tenth are basically ethnic Japanese. So not foreign nationals who came to Japan and migrated here and sort of ended up staying, but really ethnic Japanese who, for whatever reason, like me, they lived in a Muslim country, or they might have married a Muslim, or it just happened. So, there is this kind of population. In 2010, it came to light that the police had been monitoring all Muslims, at least all foreign Muslims, from 2004. What happened was these internal documents, one day they were just on the internet. They were leaked on the internet, a whole trove, over 140 internal documents. To this day, we don't know who did it. We don't know why they did it. But what is clear is that they are real documents. They're really internal documents showing this massive surveillance operation of all Muslims. And of course, the justification was that they are security threats, that they are potential terrorists. So, this came to light, and included in all of this sort of monitoring, we were talking police, renting flats across the street from masjids, 24/7 surveillance, following people, finding out where they live, all this kind of stuff. So Yeah, so included in those internal documents were very sort of personal information of a lot of particular people. So, names and addresses, and immigration history, and also level of devotion to the religion. Does he pray 5 times a day? Does he, attend masjid every Friday? This kind of stuff, because that was also used as a marker for, being a potential terrorist. The more religious you are, the more dangerous you are. That was, it's stated very open. So those people got a group of those people, a group of the victims got together and they sued the state for this surveillance operation. Now, long story short, the court awarded them a certain amount of damages for their personal information having been leaked over the internet. So it was not that the operation itself, as they had argued, it was not that the operation itself was unlawful. It's not that the operation itself was against human rights. But it's just, okay, the police gathered this information, there's no problem, but they should have been more careful in managing it and made sure that it didn't, go leaking on the internet. So it was treated almost like, like some kind of private company, and their customer data had been leaked. And this was, this was a narrative that was propagated in the media for over and over and over. And eventually the court adopted this narrative. So, definitely there is a whole sort of, at least an official narrative that Muslims are potential terrorist threats. And it remains the case to this day. Frankly, I still see, people, clearly police officers sort of, lurking around masjids. I see these guys, so they're around. But, it's only slowly starting to become the kind of culture war or threat to our culture narrative that we see in Europe. I see it a little bit, but probably the population is not as significant, and that's probably why. But certainly, for example, in like one of the suburbs of Tokyo, there is an area where there are only a couple of thousand Kurds in Japan, but they tend to live there. And this is called, it's called, what is the name of the area, neighborhood is called Warabi. And so this is oftenly referred to in a derogatory way as Warabistan. And you go there and it's like you're not in Japan anymore. What's happening? And you go to the council flats where they live, and you hear them praying, and what the hell is going on here? So you do see that. You do see that in this tabloids now and then, and you do see it in social media, but it hasn't yet, certainly hasn't yet attained the kind of level of prominence that we see in Europe. But maybe just give it a little bit more time. It is very worrying, of course.
Yeah, we are coming to the end of our time, so I want to ask you one last question about your work, and also the correlation between authoritarian regimes and their attack on human rights groups. We saw that in India, of course. Amnesty officials were spied by Israeli spyware. Sure. In many other countries. Israel also, I think, put 4 Palestinian human rights groups on its terror list. So generally throughout the world, in the Middle East, of course, human rights groups prescribed, officials in prison. So as a practitioner yourself, knowing that there's a correlation with the rise of authoritarianism, and how do you feel about the work that you do? How do you feel about, Japan's rise towards authoritarianism and generally around the world? How does that make you feel? Sure.
Well, one thing that has to be said is, it's not just places like China or Israel where, obviously it's terrible and they have to shape up, but in many ways one would expect these kind of, brutal human rights violations from a number of these countries. But I think you interviewed Farid recently. And when you just look at what happened to him in Austria, it is a shockingly egregious example of a government targeting basically human rights defenders and coming up with these, what are always clearly trumped up, charges of being a terrorist and all this kind of thing, and doing their utmost to ruin his life, not making sure he couldn't access his bank accounts, all these kind of things. And that really, it just goes to show that it's human rights work can be dangerous anywhere. And it's not just, of course, certainly I have all the respect in the world for human rights defenders in Palestine and in China and, India and all these places. There's no question. But human rights work can be dangerous anywhere. It just goes to show how human rights work, how people in power are threatened by human rights work anywhere, even in countries that are, often looked upon as sort of shining examples of liberal democracy. So it's, it just goes to show how important it is. If people in power are that threatened by it, then, that clearly means that we're doing something right. And it shows, it just shows that the struggle goes on, and it shows how important that struggle is, and that we have to keep on continuing at it. And we have to make sure that we do it in solidarity. I mean, that's really the important thing, Human rights activists everywhere, have to we have to work on human rights issues all over the world and understand that this is a global struggle and not just something confined to one particular country or region. It's something that we all have to be involved in. And inshallah, justice will triumph in the end. I do believe that. But it's the struggle goes on, I think.
Yeah. Thank you, Saul. I found this really interesting conversation. It's a big topic.
Yes.
I hope we've just opened the door to having more conversations on what is a real global phenomenon. And hopefully we can have you on the show another time as well to discuss more in detail the Middle Eastern angle to all this. And because as it's a vast topic of discussion. I want to thank you for joining us. And of course, our viewers at home, thank you very much, and hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.